All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar concerning network security and resiliency for small and rural communications providers. My name is Guy Benson, and I will be moderating today's panel. I am a senior attorney here at the FCC, and am currently working in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau's Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division. Today, we are pleased to have 4 presenters from various parts of the Commission to talk about network security and resiliency. The topics reflect our Bureau Chief, Lisa Folk's prioritization of public safety and the importance of secure, resilient, and available networks in furthering this goal. Today's webinar will consist of 4 parts. First, we tackle cybersecurity for small businesses. Second, we look at recommendations for small carriers as they make the transition to next-generation 911 systems. Next, we will discuss the network outage and disaster reporting systems. And finally, the Wireline Competition Bureau will review the recently released Supply Chain Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. We plan to have time for a couple of questions at the end of each presentation, and again at the end of everybody's presentations for a few more minutes. We will end the webinar at 12:10 p.m. So first up, we have Sanford Williams, who will be discussing cybersecurity for small businesses. Sanford is the director of the Office of Communications Business Opportunities here at the FCC. He has worked in various roles at the Commission since 1999. Sanford enrolled at Cornell University at the age of 15, where he earned his undergraduate degree in operations research and industrial engineering, and an MBA from the Johnson School of Management. In 1996, he received a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. Sanford, want to take it away?
Thank you, Guy. Good morning. My name is Sanford Williams. Our office works with small businesses. In working with small businesses, one of the most frequent inquiries we receive is about cybersecurity. Hopefully, I can provide some useful information about cybersecurity generally and small business cybersecurity specifically. Let's start with some background. First, economic loss due to cybercrime is predicted to reach $3 trillion by 2020, and 74% of the world's businesses can expect to be hacked in the coming year, according to the World Economic Forum. In 2018, the global cost of cybersecurity reached $600 billion. America's 30 million small businesses create about 2 out of every 3 new jobs in the U.S. each year, and more than half of Americans either own or work for a small business. The number of cyber attacks on small businesses is rising according to a 2018 study, with 67% of small businesses experiencing a cyber attack and 58% experiencing a data breach in the last 12 months, according to the Panama Institute. The Panama Institute study also states that 60% of small businesses surveyed cited a negligent employee or contractor as being the root cause for a breach, compared to 37% pointing to an external hacker. Respondents indicated that their 2 biggest password-related pain points are having to do with passwords being stolen or compromised and employees using weak passwords. Small businesses continue to struggle with insufficient personnel and budget. 74% of respondents note they do not have the appropriate personnel and budget to effectively mitigate cyber risks. Yet nearly half of all respondents say they have no understanding of how to protect their companies against cyber attacks. The FCC has a cyber planner to assist small businesses. The cyber planner is called the Small Biz Cyber Planner 2.0, and it's an online resource to help small businesses navigate cybersecurity. Here are some hopefully helpful tips, and these tips are also online, which I'll get back to at the end of the presentation. The first tip is to train employees in security principles. Establish basic security practices and policies for employees, such as requiring strong passwords, and establish appropriate internet use guidelines that detail penalties for violating company cybersecurity policies. Also establish rules of behavior. And these rules should be looked at regularly because, as you all know, the cybersecurity world is changing drastically and dramatically. Number 2, Protect information, computers, and networks from cyber attacks. Keep quote-unquote clean machines. Having the latest software, security, web browser, and operating system are the best defenses against viruses, malware, and other online threats. Set antivirus software to run after a scan after each update. Number 3, provide firewall security for your internet connection. A firewall is a set of related programs that prevent outsiders from accessing data on a private network. Make sure the operating system's firewall is enabled or install free firewall software available online. And this is important. If employees work from home or from outside of the workplace, ensure their systems are protected by a firewall. Number 4, create a mobile device action plan. Mobile devices can create significant security and management challenges, especially if they hold confidential information or can access the corporate network. Require users to password protect their devices, encrypt their data, and install security apps. Be sure to set reporting procedures for lost or stolen equipment. Number 5, make backup copies of important business data and information. Regularly back up the data on all computers. Critical data includes word processing documents, electronic spreadsheets, databases, financial files, human resource files, and accounts receivable and payable files. Backup data automatically if possible, and store the copies either off-site or in the cloud. Number 6, control physical access to computers and create user accounts for each employee. Prevent access or use of business computers by unauthorized individuals. Laptops can be particularly thorny and easy targets for theft or can be lost. Make sure a separate user account is created for each employee and require strong passwords. Number 7, secure your Wi-Fi networks. If you have a Wi-Fi network for your workplace, make sure it is secure, encrypted, and hidden. Number 8, employ best practices on payment cards. Work with banks or processors to ensure the most trusted and validated tools and anti-fraud services are being used. Add additional security obligations pursuant to agreements with your bank or processor. Number 9, limit employee access to data and information, and limit authority to install software. And number 10, passwords and authentication. Require employees to use unique passwords and change passwords at least every 3 months. Consider implementing multi-factor authentication that requires additional information beyond the password to gain entry. The FCC and many other agencies have useful resources which you can use to help you in your cybersecurity journey. Online, we have listed some FCC resources, which includes the FCC Cyber Planner, the FCC Cybersecurity Tip Sheet, the FCC OCBO, or Operations Communications Business Opportunities Cybersecurity page, and then there are many, many other resources to help, including the Small Business Cybersecurity Corner, which is published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, N-I-S-T, the Cybersecurity Resources Roadmap, which is put out by the Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity for Small Business by the Federal Trade Commission, Managing a Small Business, which is published by the SBA, Small Business Administration, and Cybercrime, which is published by the FBI. All these online resources can be looked up on the presentation online. Finally, I have a few concepts I think I want to mention to kind of reinforce what we talked about here and what we'll talk about going forward. There are 3 concepts I think that can be very helpful in cybersecurity. Collaboration, education, and communication. Collaboration. Collaboration is working with others, obviously, to find best practices. Oftentimes in business, collaboration is not what folks are looking for, or is permitted, or is not permitted, for various reasons. But in terms of cybersecurity, it's also always good to collaborate with folks who understand what's going on in your field and outside your field, because you can always get best practices from other people by collaborating. Education, stay informed. The cybersecurity space is dynamic. It's very important to stay informed and on top of what's going on in cybersecurity. And finally, communication. Communicate with your employees, with your clients, and with cybersecurity experts. In order to have the best cybersecurity plan, you need as much information as possible. And being static is not an option. So that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Thanks very much, Sanford. Those sound like some great tips. First of all, let me just remind folks out there that they can send questions to Network Resiliency Webinar at fcc.gov. We have someone accepting those email questions, and we'll be happy to answer those. We do have a couple questions here, Sanford. Who is responsible for cybersecurity in a small business?
It's a great question, Guy. Everyone. Cybersecurity is one of those items which is truly a team effort. Everyone nowadays, no matter what business you work at, has access to computers, so everyone is basically responsible for cybersecurity.
Okay, and what happens, here's another question. What happens if a business does not have the money to implement extensive cybersecurity measures?
Another great question. Every company does not have the resources to pay to get the best experts, so to speak, or the best advice. However, as I mentioned earlier, under the page FCC and other federal resources, there are tons of resources from federal agencies and other entities which can help people who cannot afford extensive cybersecurity help. So there is help out there. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact the FCC.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Sanford.
Thank you, Guy.
So next up, we have Ryan Hedgepeth, a telecommunications systems specialist who will review recommendations of the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, also known as CISRIC, for the transition by small carriers to next generation 911. Ryan has been with the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau since 2018. Prior to the FCC, he served as a senior engineer with the Department of Homeland Security, developing IP solutions with commercial service providers for the Government Emergency Telecommunications Service and Wireless Priority Service. Ryan has a BS in computer engineering and electrical engineering from North Carolina State University and an MS in engineering management from George Washington University. Ryan, want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. So I'll be covering the CISRIC recommendations for small carriers on transition to NG 911. Just a little background on CISRIC. CISRIC is what's referred to as a federal advisory committee, and so it provides recommendations at the FCC's tasking. And the CISRIC is made up of representatives from industry, trade associations, as well as federal, state, and local government officials. So the FCC tasked CISRIC with providing recommendations to carriers in order to aid the public safety community's transition to NG 911. And then in response, CISRIC developed recommended measures to improve both legacy 911 and NG 911 systems. Additionally, CISRIC recommended actions for the FCC which would encourage cybersecurity efforts in the private sector in order to detect and deter threats to 911 and the EZNet perimeter, or Emergency Services NG 911 perimeter. Further, the resulting recommendations identified tools that are already available and not burdensome to implement, to include a set of best practices. Going further, the FCC recognized that small carriers have unique challenges in implementing and migrating to an NG 911 system, and further tasked the CISRIC with recommendations for an NG 911 readiness checklist for small carriers. In response, the CISRIC recommended what small carriers should do to be ready on time to deliver their 911 traffic in an NG 911 compatible manner, what economic disadvantages, if any, may impede small carriers in the implementation of NG 911, and what barriers to implementation, if any, the FCC should address. There's a lot of information in these recommendations. Today I'm just going to cover what small carriers should do to be ready on time to deliver their 911 traffic in an NG 911 compatible manner, but I'd like to point you to the footnote, which is a link to the document. It's a great resource. It has a lot of information and links to further information, so I can only cover just a little bit of it today. So the CISRIC recommended 4 key transition activities: understanding the plans and timelines for state regional 911 authority, identifying the technology changes that need to be implemented on the network, identifying organizational impacts such as training and job duties, and understanding the interoperability requirements with the EZNet and other carriers. So I'll go through each of these in more detail in the upcoming slides. To start This is the state of the NG 911 transition according to the National 911 Program. The National 911 Program annually surveys states regarding their progress towards evolving to 911. And in the 2017 survey, they found, out of the 45 states that responded, they found 20 states have developed a statewide NG 911 plan, 20 states have issued RFPs for NG 911 components, 22 states have installed and deployed and tested NG 911 systems or components, and 10 states can 100% process and interpret NG 911 location and caller information. The National 911 Program is currently collecting 2018 data and should be filing that report shortly. But basically, the fundamental message here is that NG 911 is transitioning. States and localities are pushing forward, and so carriers need to be ready for this transformation, both whether they're in an IP or a legacy state. CISRC transition activity 2 is identifying the technology changes to implement in the network. So here is, on the right, you'll see a reference architecture. This is actually an ATIS standard, but it's in the recommendations, and this shows basically what the architecture looks like from a legacy originating network to an NG 911 system. And to the left is my crude document that basically shows that you have three moving systems. You have the wireline migration from legacy to IP, you have 911 systems migration from legacy to IP, and you have wireless migration from legacy IP. And this document covers all the different possible interconnections that could come up between these network segments. Obviously, you're familiar with legacy to legacy, but then you have a legacy to IP environment, an IP to legacy environment, and ultimately, hopefully, an IP to IP transition. Identifying organizational impacts such as training and job duties. So a dedicated team should be committed to the 911 ecosystem and the 911 migration. Further, carriers should consider SIP training and best practices to enable their staff to provision reliable and secure trunks. Another big portion of this document is dedicated to cybersecurity. As Sanford already mentioned a lot of it, but I'll point that, as he also mentioned, you need to prepare your workforce for NG 911 ecosystem and clarify roles, training the team, and updating job description. NG 911 will present unique challenges than traditional 911 because in an IP to IP environment, you can now have data, video, text coming into the PSAP. I know for a fact there's been a few ransomware attacks that have come over the administrative lines, but once the IP lines are opened up, then the PSAPs can become vulnerable for emergency traffic being, marked as emergency and transmitted as emergency, but it being a cyber attack. So the earlier these cyber incidents are caught in the network, the better and the less likely the 911 systems will be impacted. Additionally, the cybersecurity section lists the NIST framework and multiple Department of Homeland Security resources. And this includes the National Cybersecurity Coordination and Integration Center, which is run by DHS, and that helps coordinate threats so that specifically for small carriers, if a large carrier is experiencing a threat, that this information is transitioned into the NCIC, and it'd be a useful contact for small carriers to develop as their cybersecurity efforts mature. Understanding interoperability requirements with the EZINet and carriers. So this is basically tying the first transition activity with establishing 911 coordination with your carrier, and then transition 2 is establishing an IP connectivity. And then this is basically coordinating your IP evolution with the EZINet evolution. And so here I show 3 different architectures, all of which are in the recommendations. The one to the left is a legacy VoIP network connecting with a selective router. The one to the right is the one I already showed, which is a legacy network connecting to an IP network, leveraging a legacy network gateway. And finally, there's the IP to IP interface. And as these NG911 providers transition to IP, they're going to expect their carriers to deliver their traffic in an IP manner as well, so that they can leverage the full capability of these systems. Further, the IP to IP connection requires a lot less interfaces and is not nearly as complex to upkeep. So another big portion of the CISRIC recommendation is the small carriers checklist to transition to NG911. And for each of these, for this checklist, for each section, they define 3 states: a legacy state, which is a TDM type connection to a selective router; a transitional state, where the NG911 service provider has deployed some aspects of an NG911 system; and finally, an end state, where the small carrier has deployed an IP-based network. And so the checklist will go through a number of essential elements for each of these states. So I'll go through those essential elements now. Public safety, government, and regulatory matters. So there's a lot of issues, especially with small carriers, regarding working around the utility requirements, and understanding these requirements and these constraints up front is critical, whether you're in the legacy, transitional, or end state. Further, they go into routing location and GIS data. Obviously, location is becoming more and more important, especially in the wireless arena. So transitioning these GIS data, these routing locations, and making sure that the NG911 system is routing to the correct PSAP in the correct jurisdiction, and that data is updated timely. I've went through the network capabilities and quite a bit on security. Finally, is operation planning. So operation planning, we talked about how it's important to ensure that you have a dedicated team, but another portion of NG911 is to ensure that it stays up at all times, and then has redundant, resilient network services. And that includes, continuity operations planning. And finally is optional interfaces. These are non-standard interfaces and that some carriers may need. Let's go forward here. Sorry. So conclusion, that was brief. CISRIC recommended, as I said before, that carriers should stay abreast of the NG911 transition to better understand the ecosystem, timelines, and implications for their company. Carriers should establish contact with the NG911 authorities within their service area and gather information such as implementation schedules and functionality expectations. Carriers should consider SIP training and best practices to enable their staff to provision reliable and secure trunks. And finally, carriers should prepare their staff for cybersecurity issues related to NG911. And most of all, please take a look at the document, as it well over 70 pages of useful information and further links to more detailed information. That's all I have. Yeah.
Well, thanks. And yeah, we'll have those documents up on the event page after the presentation today. And just remind folks again to keep sending those questions to Network Resiliency Webinar at fcc.gov. Ryan, we have one question here. How can we find the appropriate NG911 contact?
From a state and local perspective, I would ask you to look at NASNA 911, North American, NASNA911.org, and that should have a great contact for a statewide NG911 coordinator. Additionally, I think you can email the questions line, and we can help put you in contact with the right person. So.
Okay, sounds good. And also, we will have the slides that we're presenting today also on the webpage, on the event page. So thank you, Ryan. For our next presentation, we have Julia Tu, who will be talking about the Commission's network outage and disaster information reporting systems. Julia joined the FCC in 2007. She is an engineer in the Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. She earned her undergraduate degree in electrical engineering at the University of Maryland, College Park. She also has a master's degree in electrical and computer engineering from Johns Hopkins University. In both 2012 and 2013, Julia received the FCC Excellence in Engineering Award. Julia, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Guy. Good morning. This is Julia Tu, and I will be talking about two reporting systems. One is the Network Outage Reporting System, we call it NORS, and the Disaster Information Reporting System, we call it DIRS. NORS is for daily reporting of network outages, and DIRS is only activated during a disaster. For the Network Outage Reporting System, NORS, our goals are to improve network reliability. We check for trends in outage category. As you can see in this chart about VoIP outages, that's one of the charts that we generated from the information in NORS. We then work with providers to come up with ways to improve the reliability of the network. Also, our goal is to have situational awareness of major events. In NORS, we collect E911, wireline, wireless, VoIP, and facility outages. Information in NORS is presumptively confidential and only shared with the Department of Homeland Security. However, aggregated information may be shared with the public. Not all outages are reportable in NORS. Outages that last 30 minutes or more and reach one of the thresholds are reportable. We use 900,000 user minutes as a threshold for most outages, including VoIP, wireline, wireless, and E911. To determine user minutes, you need to multiply the number of potentially user affected by the duration of the outage. As an example, if the outage affected 3,000 users and lasted for 600 minutes or 5 hours, this outage is reportable. Less than that is not a reportable event. For OC3, with similar calculation, you need to multiply the number of OC3 affected by the duration of the outage. If that number is 667 or more, the outage is reportable. Also, NORS reportable events include outages that affect SS7, special facilities, and satellite. The NOR reporting processes. According to Port 4 rules, providers have to submit a notification report within 2 hours after the event started, with the exception of VoIP. For VoIP E911 outages, it's 4 hours, and for other VoIP outages, it's 24 hours. For initial report, with the exception of VoIP outages, initial report has to be submitted within 3 days after the incident date. Note that initial reports are not required for VoIP outages. Within 30 days after the incident date, final report has to be submitted for all outages, which include VoIP outages. This slide shows some of the elements that contain in the final NOR report, such as when outage occurred, description of the outage, duration of the outage, location of effects of the outage, number of customers affected, causes of the event. We want to know whether or not the event was caused by suspicious activity. Part of network involved, step taken to prevent future occurrences. In NORS, we have a link to all the CISRIC best practices, including the one that Ryan mentioned earlier. You can check the list and then indicate which best practices relate to the outage that you found in NORS. Also, we need the contact information about the outage in case we need to reach out to you for clarification. Analyzing the NORS data. Every day, we review outages that come in, as well as final reports of major outages such as E911, major wireless, wireless, and VoIP events. On a quarterly basis, our team analyzes final reports for outage trends and provide the result to the Network Reliability Steering Committee. The aggregated information is presented at the NRSC public meetings. They have 4 meetings every year, and we typically send out information about this meeting to all coordinators in NORS, and you all are welcome to join these meetings. Besides, we also prepare analysis of individual company, and we have meeting or conference call with those company. And that's an overview of NORS. Next, I will talk about the Disaster Information Reporting System, or DIRS. With DIRS, we only collect DIRS information during a disaster event. Our goals are to track status of communication access and recovery efforts during disasters. With DIRS, we have consistent information. We collect information about the status of PSAP, major equipment, facility, number of customer out of service, number of block calls, cell site by county, and broadcast stations. As you can see on this slide, this map and chart are the ones we generated based on the cell site by county information in DIRS during Hurricane Maria. Similar to NORS, information in DIRS is presumptively confidential and only shared with the Department of Homeland Security. Aggregated information may be shared with the public. Some benefits for communication provider when you sign up in DIRS. We have designate contact, which allows providers to identify the appropriate contact for the company during emergency. Receive help. If you need a generator or fuel or anything that you need to restore service that you don't know who to contact, you can use the help option in DIRS and fill out the information. We can then send your information to the right people to help you. Streamline requests. This can reduce the number of requests from various government agencies for the status of communication during a disaster. Other government agencies will rely on the FCC for status of each station. Aid your community. Provides communities with critical updates and risk communication information from reliable sources during emergency. The DIRS reporting process. When a disaster occurs, the FCC works with FEMA to determine whether to activate DIRS. Once DIRS is activated, the FCC notifies all companies in DIRS. Company would then access DIRS and submit information in the system. The FCC generates situation reports, maps, and charts to send to the Emergency Support Function, ESF2. It also generates the public report to be published on the FCC website. I also want to note that, again, that we only publish aggregated information. Scope of DIRS data. We collect reporting in DIRS including PSAP, major equipment, wireless mobile switching center, wireless cell site by county, inter-office facility, remote aggregation devices, blocking, broadcast station, and cable system. Here are the charts and maps that we generated from the information in DIRS. Since the hurricane season has started, we want to mention the emergency checklist that members of the Network Reliability Steering Committee prepared. Some examples include making sure that you have mitigation plans for equipment or sites that are located in flood-prone areas. Another example would be deploy high tensile strength aerial service wire or negotiate a wider right-of-way to prevent trees from obstructing aerial cable. Design the outside portion of the network to better withstand flooding and severe weather and make restoration easier. This is some of the example in the checklist, but you can access the complete list in the link that we provided in this slide. And that concludes my presentation. I'm not sure if we have any questions.
Thanks, Julia. We do have a couple of questions here. Let's see. The first one is who can sign up in NORS and DERS?
Good. And anybody can sign up in NORS and DERS, but you can only see the information that you submit in the system. And if you want to oversee the information that your company filed, you need to send out a request, and we'll upgrade you to be a coordinator for the companies so you can see that. So in short, anybody can sign up in the system, and you can only see the report that you file.
Okay. And one other question. Do providers have to report in both NORS and DERS at the same time when DERS is activated?
When DERS is activated, if you have communication access in the disaster areas that we specify in the activation letter, then you can submit the report in DERS, and you don't have to submit the report in. You are exempt from submitting the report in NORS. However, if you have communication access outside of the disaster area, you have to submit that information in NORS. So you don't have to submit information in both NORS and DERS at the same time for the same communication access.
Okay, and let's keep those questions coming. Just send us an email at networkresiliencywebinar@fcc.gov. Thank you very much, Julia. Finally, we have up Justin Falb to discuss the supply chain notice of proposed rulemaking. Justin Falb is legal advisor to Wireline Competition Bureau Chief Chris Monteith and the designated federal officer for the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. He has been at the commission for 3 years, all in the Wireline Competition Bureau, outside of a stint as acting special counsel in the office of the chairman. Prior to the commission, he was assistant general counsel at a large trade association, and before that worked as an associate attorney in private practice for 6 years. Justin received his law degree from the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and with a certificate from the Institute for Communications Law Studies. And his undergraduate degree was from Miami University with honors. Justin, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Guy. So last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about a proceeding that may impact some of your companies, the people who are on this webinar. The USF Supply Chain NPRM, or as it's officially titled, the Protecting Against National Security Threats to the Communications Supply Chain through FCC Programs Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, was adopted by the Commission on April 17, 2018. The NPRM sought comment on a proposal to prohibit, going forward, the use of Universal Service Fund money to purchase equipment or services from any communications equipment or service providers identified as posing a national security risk to communications equipment or the communications supply chain. The USF Supply Chain NPRM comes after executive and legislative branch over the last decade on these issues, including a 2012 House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence report that recommended U.S. government agencies and federal contractors exclude from their systems equipment from certain communications companies with connections hostile to foreign governments. A May 2013 presidential policy directive that required federal agencies to work together to identify vulnerabilities in communications infrastructure and to increase the resiliency of critical infrastructure. A May 2017 executive order that emphasized the importance of security of federal networks and critical communications infrastructure, and the 2018 NDAA, which bars the Department of Defense from using Huawei or ZTE for critical programs and bars all federal agencies from using products or services from Kaspersky Labs. And more recently, the executive and legislative branch have also been active. The 2019 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, prohibits executive agencies from expending loan or grant funds to procure systems or services, covered telecommunications equipment, as a substantial or essential component of a system, and requires the head of the FCC to prioritize available funding and technical support to affected entities. We'll talk about this in a minute. Also, just last month, the May 2019 executive order authorizes the Secretary of Commerce to regulate the acquisition and use of information and communications technology services from a foreign adversary. So going back to the supply chain NPRM, it also sought comment on the types of equipment and services that should be covered by the proposed rule. Should the Commission prohibit the use of universal service funds on any purchases from companies identified as raising national security risks? Or are there reasons to exempt certain categories or types of equipment or services from the scope of the proposed rule? The NPRM also asks what the effective date for the proposed rule should be. How long do USF recipients need to begin complying with the proposed rule? And how does the presence of a multi-year contract impact any effective date? Further, the supply chain NPRM asks, how should the Commission identify companies that pose a national security risk to the integrity of communication networks or a communication supply chain? For example, should the FCC rely on existing statutes or on a list of companies maintained by another federal agency? It asks, what are the costs and benefits associated with the proposed rule? And what is the Commission's legal authority to act? Transitioning over to the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, which was actually enacted in August of 2018, Section 889B1 of the 2019 NDAA prohibits the head of an executive agency from obligating or expending loan or grant funds to procure or obtain, extend or renew a contract to procure or obtain, or enter into a contract or extend or renew a contract to procure or obtain equipment, services, or systems that use covered telecommunications equipment or services as a substantial or essential component of any system, or as critical technology as part of any system. The 2019 NDAA defines covered telecommunications equipment or services as those including telecommunications equipment produced by Huawei or ZTE, or a subsidiary or affiliate of any of those entities. Section 889B2 provides that the heads of executive agencies administering loan, grant, or subsidy programs, specifically names the chairman of the FCC in this section, shall implementing the prohibition in paragraph 1, prioritize available funding and technical support to assist entities affected by the prohibition in Section 889B1. The FCC put out a public notice seeking comment on the impact of the NDAA on the supply chain proceeding on October 26, 2018, including seeking question on how or what does the prioritize available funding and technical support to assist entities affected by the prohibition actually mean. More recently, just last month, President Trump signed the executive order on securing the Information and Communications Technology and Services Supply Chain Executive Order. This EO authorizes the Secretary of Commerce to regulate the acquisition or use of information and communication technology services from a foreign adversary. It provides that the Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with other agencies, including the FCC, may prohibit any acquisition, importation, transfer, installation, dealing in, or use of any information and communications technology or service by any person or with respect to any property subject to the jurisdiction of the United States for certain transactions deemed to pose unacceptable risks to national security. The executive order also placed the Secretary of Commerce in consultation with other named departments, agencies, and offices within the federal government, including the FCC, to prepare regulations consistent with the executive order within 150 days of release of the EO, which means the deadline will be October 15, 2019. Upon the Secretary determining that a particular transaction or classes of transactions pose a threat to the national security, the executive order will apply to such transactions initiated, pending, or completed after the date of the executive order. The executive order includes a number of reporting requirements that individuals on this webinar might be interested in. The Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with the Secretary of State, is authorized to submit recurring and final reports to Congress on the national emergency declared in the executive order. The Director of National Intelligence, or DNI, is required to produce periodic written assessments of threats to the communications supply chain to the President and the Secretary of Commerce. The first assessment is due within 40 days of the executive order, with further assessments completed at least annually. The Secretary of Homeland Security, in coordination with sector-specific agencies and coordinating councils, must produce an assessment of vulnerabilities that pose the greatest threats to national security within 80 days of the executive order and annually thereafter. And within 1 year of the date of the executive order and annually thereafter, the Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with a number of other agencies, including the Chairman of the FCC, shall assess and report to the President whether actions taken by the Secretary pursuant to the order are sufficient and continue to be necessary to mitigate the risks identified in and pursuant to the executive order. So you might ask, why is this important for small carriers? Well, all carriers, including small carriers, must be mindful of supply chain security. With the forthcoming deployment of 5G networks, the security of networks takes on a new level of importance. Nations hostile to the United States could use equipment to access sensitive information, harm critical infrastructure, or conduct economic and industrial espionage. So you should ask yourself, do you have equipment, or are you considering equipment in your network that would be potentially impacted by the FCC's proposed rule, or the other recent federal activities concerning U.S. supply chain security? And I would add, keeping an eye on Congress, as there are a number of bills that are introduced on this issue. Carriers should plan ahead and participate. While comment periods are closed, the supply chain proceeding is ongoing, and we look forward to hearing from you or your trade associations. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin. We do have a handful of questions here. The first one is, when are you going to act on the national security NPRM?
So under the executive order, the Commerce Department has the lead on the executive branch recommendations. In addition to the challenging issues raised by the Commission in the NPRM and the subsequent further notice, in deciding how and best to move ahead with the order, we need to consult with Commerce and the other appropriate agencies per the direction of the executive order.
Okay. Here's another one. Many companies and some on the Hill believe that the federal government may need to help small rural companies pay for removing equipment already installed. What is your response?
So this is an important issue, and the 2018 NPRM raised the question of how the Commission should deal with this more broadly, including whether we should consider actions beyond Universal Service Fund equipment, whether there might be a need to remove equipment that's already deployed, and more. These are important issues with potentially large financial impacts, so we're still looking at them, and we ask that you continue to look at them internally as well.
Okay, we have a couple more here. Is the FCC subject to the executive order on this issue?
So we're working closely with the other relevant executive branch agencies to implement the executive order to protect the nation's critical infrastructure.
All right, thanks. Well, we have a couple other questions that have come in. Let's see. Julia, we have a question that looks appropriate to you here. The question is, how does the FCC use DERS information?
Okay, thanks. Good questions. We use DERS information to, as I mentioned earlier, to generate situation report to send to FEMA and Emergency Support Function ESF2 to help with restoration effort during disaster. We also provide public with communication update during the disaster. because we generate public report based on the DIRS data and publish on the FCC website. Also, we use DIRS information in our study or investigation of communication outages during disaster, so we can have lesson learned for next year.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have one for Akbo, for Sanford. What kind of outreach does Akbo do for small and rural providers?
All right, thanks, Guy. We participate in conferences and meetings and interact with the Small Business Administration to reach as many providers as possible. We also post pertinent info on our website, the OCBO website, which is part of the FCC website. Finally, we do work on events such as the Supplier Diversity Workshop, which was held here at the Commission in Washington, D.C. last June.
Great. And just one more question here. This one looks like should be for Ryan. What have been the most significant gotchas documented by states that are performing or have completed their NG 911 transitions?
Well, it's a complex issue because we've spoken with a number of states, and no two states seem to have the same NG 911 architecture. And so that's why it's really critical to just coordinate with your state and your NG 911 associate or NASNA representative. And further, some states do a statewide deployment, other states do sub-states or regional deployments. So again, it's very situational. And that's why you really need to coordinate with your NG 911 representative.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for being a part of our presentation today. I just want to remind folks again that all of the documents and the PowerPoint slide that we use today will be on the events page that you went to sign up for this webinar. And we will continue to monitor the email address Network Resiliency Webinar at fcc.gov for folks that might be watching this at a later date, and we will make every effort to answer the questions that have come in. So it looks like we're going to wrap this up. So thanks again, and have a great day.